Good morning. We'll try that again. Our speaker this morning is Alan Fisher. I think most of you know Al. He's a retired sociology professor at Coe College and probably knows more of the history of this church than most people here, having written the book In the Heart of the City with David Hay. Al has been a frequent speaker, and today he's speaking on a rich nation, poor citizens. And I think he needs to be applauded for his courage in tackling that topic in 45 minutes. I think that's one where we could just get warmed up in 45 minutes and probably go on for quite some time. So I'm not going to waste any time here. Simply give you Al Fisher to start his presentation.
Thank you, Jim. I hope you'll excuse my get-up, but I have about zero time between when this class ends and when I need to be upstairs to be with the choir. Thank you for inviting me to address this topic. It's one with which I've long been concerned. I think I counted 10 times at Coe when I taught a senior seminar on the topic poverty in the United States, and Bruce audited one of those. So this is a topic on which there's an enormous amount of material, so I'll do my best to make some basic points in the next half hour and then leave the last 15 minutes for questions. I wrote out much of what I wanted to say today, and as usual got carried away. So I may not have time to cover much of this, but if you're interested, you can look at it on your own. I put about a dozen sources on the last page, most of them books that have been published in the last year or two, because there have been some major changes in public policy, though I'm not sure how much those have been diffused to the general public. I was surprised and a bit amused last week to read a column by David Brooks of the New York Times, a conservative columnist whose work I greatly admire, who said, Marco Rubio has this wonderful idea of allowing states to shape their own welfare policies. Why didn't anybody think of that before? I thought, well, looking at a daily newspaper for the last 19 years, since that very thing was done in the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, might have provided some helpful background. And the result of that is what often happens when the federal government gives block grants to states and says, you can shape your own policies, set your own eligibility and benefit levels and so forth. What often happens then is that states go their own way. In fact, there were really no restrictions that that money formerly used for welfare be used for anything having to do with the poor. So about half the money that states get in the form of block grants today doesn't go for poverty at all. So arguing about what should be done about welfare is a little bit like arguing about evolution. As my late colleague Fred Willhart used to say, the data are in. We know that welfare is hardly exists anymore in most states. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. My first political memory came in 1960 during the presidential campaign between Senator John Kennedy, the Democratic candidate, and Vice President Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate. Kennedy had campaigned vigorously in West Virginia before the primary there. He wanted to demonstrate something very crucial to his candidacy, and that is that he could attract a significant Protestant vote, since his being a Catholic was a very big deal. It's estimated about a third of the voters switched their usual political affiliation because of the religious issue. He did very well there, really beat Hubert Humphrey decisively. But Kennedy was deeply moved by the poverty that he had seen in West Virginia. And he repeatedly said on the campaign trail, 17 million Americans go to bed hungry every night. And he was widely and roundly mocked for saying that, most famously by President Eisenhower, whose response was, I go to bed hungry every night too, my doctor just put me on Metrical, which was a popular diet drink of that time. And Mr. Nixon on the campaign trail repeatedly and gleefully repeated what I had said. In retrospect, we know that that 17 million estimate was probably very much on the low side. And yet there were best-selling books at the time, like John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society, published in 1957, that essentially said, that kind of stuff is over. Now we need to deal with quality of life issues, but poverty is confined to a couple of pockets here and there. I think even though there are still some people, Bill O'Reilly most recently about a week ago said that poverty and hunger really didn't exist in this country. I think we've moved more from denying that poverty exists to saying, to buying into particular kinds of myths about poverty. So, in the last campaign we had George Romney. I was a student in Michigan in the 60s, so I still say George rather than his son Mitt. Referred to the 47% of takers there are in American society. Ronald Reagan got a whole lot of political traction in the mid-1960s by talking about a welfare queen in Chicago. I looked this up, and contrary to what people like Paul Krugman and others say, that this is just one of Ronald Reagan's fantasies, there really was a woman named Linda Taylor in Chicago who owned 3 luxury cars, including a Cadillac, and often drove to the welfare office attired in furs. However, the amount of money she allegedly built the state of Illinois out of was $8,000 rather than the $150,000 that Reagan had alleged. And today we have a Paul Ryan saying we need to worry about what FDR had called the narcotic of dependency on public assistance. So it seems to me that we have some stereotypes and images of poverty that, while not completely erroneous, are very one-sided and misleading and exaggerated. A professor from Washington University in St. Louis argues few topics in American society have more myths and stereotypes surrounding them than poverty. Misconceptions that distort both our politics and our domestic policy making. They include the notion that poverty affects a relatively small percentage of Americans, that most poor are impoverished for years at a time, and that most of those in poverty live in inner cities, that too much welfare assistance is provided, and that poverty is ultimately a result of not working hard enough. There are dramatic differences in the results of public opinion polls taken in this country and in much of Europe. About 2/3 of Americans say that poverty is the fault of the poor, and that with enough hard work, if the poor didn't, 70% of self-described conservatives in America say that, agree with the statement that the poor have it easy because they have so many benefit programs that they can draw upon. Whereas in Europe, about 2 in 3 respondents, almost a mirror image of the United States, argue that poverty and poverty rates are very much lower in the European democracies than they are in this country, is due largely to external economic conditions. 40% of Americans between the ages of 25 and 60 will experience at least 1 year below the official poverty line during that period, and 54% will spend a year in poverty or near poverty, meaning between the poverty line and 120% of the poverty line. Put simply, poverty is a mainstream event experienced by a majority of Americans. when we claim that poverty is only the result of a pathological culture, that it's mostly self-inflicted, and we vent our rage and avert our gaze from the structural factors that help and perpetuate poverty: racial and gender discrimination, low wages, mass incarceration, educational inequalities, while simultaneously downgrading and dehumanizing those who find themselves trapped by it. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on definitions of poverty, though it's necessary to give at least some quick attention to this matter. I don't think there's anyone who would deny that poverty lines, as they have been set since the early 60s, and pretty much as they remain today, are very arbitrary and subjective, and there's a lot of argument about their adequacy. However, politicians can't seem to get together on how to change them officially. So, in 1962, Molly Orshansky, an economist at the Social Security Administration, was tasked with the job of formulating a set of poverty guidelines. And these are important for a couple of reasons. This is not just an academic exercise. One reason is it gives us a kind of report card about how we're doing. The other is that many public programs are pegged to or set by, eligibility standards for those programs are set by the poverty line. That's not always 100%, however. I remember Ralph Plagman saying from this lecture a couple of years ago that the fact that X% of students in the Cedar Rapids schools qualified for free or reduced price lunches meant that we had something like 45% of a poverty rate in the Cedar Rapids schools, when in fact kids can qualify for free or reduced price lunches with incomes below 180% of the poverty line. So the poverty line is not always the exact eligibility threshold for various programs. What Orshansky did was simply find out from the Department of Agriculture what a emergency food plan would require, how many dollars you would need to buy enough food for what was supposed to be an emergency food plan. And then based on consumer data that showed that the average American family spent a third of its income on food at that time, she tripled the amount you needed for an emergency food plan, and voila, that was a poverty line. And those were set by size of household, and those have been adjusted since then over the last 40-some years for the rate of the growth of inflation. However, that remains pretty much the way we approach the poverty line. There are some arguments that conservatives make that have considerable weight. For example, when the Census Bureau counts the number of poor and issues its report in mid-September every year, they don't count so-called in-kind programs like food stamps, housing vouchers. Mysteriously, they don't count what is probably the most effective anti-poverty program, and that is the earned income tax credit that many poor people get that lifts them out of poverty. So when the Census Bureau issues poverty statistics, they sometimes offer an alternative, but the data you are most likely to see in a daily newspaper are data on people's self-reported cash income. Christopher Jenks, a sociologist at Harvard, has argued that if you include in-kind programs, the poverty rate is at least 6% less than the figure, the 14% or so that you get today. There is a wonderful resource here in Iowa. Well, first I'll give you the national poverty thresholds. For a family of 4 today in this country, the official poverty line is $24,418. At first that may sound like a lot of money, but there's a wonderful organization in Iowa City called the Iowa Policy Project that studies poverty and inequality in the state of Iowa down to the county level. And these are their data indicating if you have a single parent with 2 children in the home, monthly expenses on the average would come to about $3,865 for annual total basic expenses of about $46,000. And I can give you the breakdown if you were interested. Also, if you ask Americans about how much money do you think a household needs in order to get by, they usually cite a figure somewhere between the mid-30s and the low 40s. So it seems to me that there is a fairly good case that could be made that the current poverty line is probably inadequately low, particularly since housing costs, child care costs, and even with Medicaid, out-of-pocket health care expenses have gone up much more rapidly than the cost of living since the early 1960s. But I hope that'll provide you a useful hook for understanding the more specific data that I'll be getting to in a little while, that for a family of 4, $24,418 is the current working, functioning poverty line. Okay, I'd like then for you to turn with me for a moment to the handout that I gave you. I'll go through pretty briskly. One of my favorite sociologists is a marvelous woman named Nancy Ammerman who teaches at Boston University. And I like, and I try to keep in mind when I read heavily statistical material, statistics on people with the tears wiped away. One of the sociologists whose work on poverty I most admire is a woman named Catherine Eden, E-D-I-N, who teaches at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. I envy people like her who can publish 2 books a year, although sometimes when I have read prefaces to books, I realize that these people hardly ever teach, which is one of the reasons they can be so productive. In the last 6 months, 2 books have come out by Eden that cover different sides of how poverty and poverty policy are changing today. One of them is titled $2 a Day, in which Eden and a couple of colleagues say that since the near-death experience of welfare starting in 1996, the number of Americans living in households where they have only $2 per person per day to spend has tripled from about 1.5% to about 4.5%. The other is It's Not Like I'm Poor, which is about the Earned Income Tax Credit. So one of the things that has happened as a result of the 96 Welfare Reform Act is that since that legislation imposed work requirements on people with welfare and time limits, you can't be on welfare for longer than 2 years at one stretch and 5 years lifetime, that means that people who don't have a job that pays much of anything are living in true penury. On the other hand, It's Not Like I'm Poor is about the people who have been able to get jobs when they've come off of welfare, and through the Earned Income Tax Credit, which can provide you as large a benefit as $6,000 a year, have been able to escape poverty. So there's been a real bifurcation or division between the working poor and those who are not working. And interestingly enough, the welfare reform legislation of '96 was constructed in such a way that it had both carrots and sticks. The sticks were the length requirements, you could be on welfare, and the work requirements. The carrots were supposed to be a kind of WPA-like job program, much more money for child care, and much more money for health care. Predictably enough, I guess, after Clinton vetoed this legislation the first two times, the Republican Congress prevailed, and the legislation that emerged essentially had all of the sticks and hardly any of the carrots, including the carrot of a job program. One of the things that I admire about Eden's work is that although she draws very heavily on bodies of quantitative data, there are a lot of numbers in these books, she also often does ethnography like an anthropologist. So she moves to the neighborhood she's studying, she gets to know the people to gain their trust and confidence, she teaches Sunday school, she gets to know the other mothers in the neighborhood and so forth. So she's one of the few sociologists I know who has kept her awareness that statistics often reflect human pain. She is not just a voyeur of other people's suffering. People of many different kinds, I would argue, in the handout, experience poverty in the United States. And no image, no stereotype of the poor comes close to including all of the 46.7 million poor persons in this country. According to the report issued in mid-September of this year, that is issued in 15 about the data from 2014, 14.8% of all Americans, about 1 in 7 were poor. That is, they lived in households where cash income was below $24,230 for a family of 4. Just for point of comparison, the median income in the U.S. today of a household is just under $54,000 a year. The lowest poverty rate ever recorded was 11% in 1973. The highest was the first year that poverty data were collected in 1959, when the rate was 22.4%. The current poverty rate in Iowa is 12.7%, about 2 points lower than the national average. In Cedar Rapids, it's 11.8%. So I want to provide you with a kind of portrait or mosaic of poverty in the United States today. And in understanding the data that I provide here, it's important to distinguish between the term poverty rate, which refers to the proportion of all people in a particular group who are poor. So if there were 25 of us here in this room and 4 of us had lived in households with poverty level incomes, the poverty rate of this group would be 16%. And percent of the poverty population, which refers to the proportion of all poor people who are members of that particular group. So the 4 poor people in here would be 0.000% of all poor people nationally. So the example I give here is about 10% of all non-Hispanic whites are poor. That's the poverty rate for non-Hispanic whites. But nearly half, about 42% of the poverty population are non-Hispanic whites. So a near majority of America's poor are white, are not Hispanic, are not black. First, by age. It's important to note that this is one area where there has been phenomenal progress against poverty. When my grandfathers died in 1959 and 1960, the poverty rate for Americans 65 and over was 35%. A couple of years ago it got down to 9%, now it's back up to 10%. So the distribution of poverty by age changed very sharply over the past 80 years, and particularly in the last 55 years, with poverty among persons 65 and over dropping dramatically. In his excellent book, Growing Old in America, David Fisher, no relative, though I would probably claim him if he were, argues that in the Great Depression of the 1930s, the unemployment rate among America's elderly was about 50%. Only 5% of elderly had any kinds of pensions at all. The unemployment rate is about 25% for the nation as a whole, so elderly were about twice as likely as the non-elderly to be poor. There's a remarkable cartoon from a Detroit newspaper in the 1930s and 40s with a sign at a factory gate saying to all people over 50 to the scrap heap. And in Reinhold Niebuhr's wonderful diary of his years as a pastor in Detroit in the 1910s and 20s, he talks about how physically exhausted and in many cases simply ruined. The men were by their 50s, unable to work anymore. So Fisher argues that probably at least 60% of the elderly were economically dependent on other people for their subsistence. And as I said, as recently as 1959, the poverty rate for the elderly was about 35%. Today, not only is it lower, but the elderly have been affected less adversely than any other age group in the American population by the Great Recession that began in 2007. I find it very interesting, having followed these kind of data for over 30 years, that the elderly have gone from being the most heavily Democratic group in the American electorate to being the most heavily Republican, even though last I looked they were the only age group that had a guaranteed annual income and guaranteed health care. I can't quite square that, but it is a fact. My late colleague Fred Wilhoit argued there's a good deal of merit to the idea that people often stick with the political party that was in power when they came to young adulthood. So just some of you knew Ellen and Dorothy Heald, who both worked in New Deal agencies in the 1930s and who were diehard Democrats. But many of the elderly today grew up in the halcyon Eisenhower 50s when economic growth for the average family was 38%, to another 34% in the 1960s. It should be noted, however, before we congratulate ourselves too enthusiastically, that the poverty rate for elderly women is about twice as high as it is for elderly men. And it should also be noted that these data are a one-time snapshot. They are not a moving picture. So there are many elderly who are fairly well off, who, because of the astronomical costs of long-term care, end up, quote, spending down to Medicaid and becoming poor. So when a member of our family died last year in a nursing home in Milwaukee, the annual bill just for a place to lay her head had come to $135,000 to go through a pretty substantial portion of heritage in a hurry that way. In sharp contrast to the reduction in poverty among the elderly, the poverty rate for children under the age of 18 has actually risen from about 16% in the early 1970s to about 23%. Today it remains higher than in any other developed nation in the world. And the poverty rate for children under 6 is even higher. I'm at the top of page 2 here. Since there are nearly twice as many kids as there are elderly in this country today, and since the poverty rate for children is about twice as high for children as it is for the elderly, that means there are 4 times as many poor kids as poor elderly, and yet we spend vastly more on the elderly than we do on children. So with some of his usual exaggeration and oversimplification, former Governor Richard Lamb of Colorado has said, poverty in America today wears diapers. It doesn't wear a hearing aid. A more accurate statement would be, poverty today is nearly 4 times as likely to wear diapers as to wear a hearing aid. And the changes in the age distribution of poverty, I think, are largely understandable by looking at changes in public policy, particularly at the federal level. So the first change has been that Social Security benefits have been made far more substantial. So many of you have seen the photo of Ida Fuller, a woman from Vermont, holding aloft the first Social Security check that went out in 1940. She had paid into the system for 3 years. She lived to be 100, not quite 101, so she really hit the lottery as far as that was concerned. But Social Security benefits were made vastly more adequate from the mid-60s to the mid-70s under Presidents Johnson and Nixon. That is, they doubled in value in real terms after inflation over that 10-year period. Half of America's elderly today would be poor if Social Security did not exist, and a majority of the elderly get more than half of their income from Social Security. So Social Security, even though it is not explicitly a program for the poor, is by far our most effective anti-poverty program. Other favorable changes, though this isn't a good time to mention this, have been the indexing of Social Security to the rate of inflation, sort of, maybe sometimes, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, and the passage of Medicare in 1965, 35 days before my dad's 65th birthday, which provides health insurance for Americans age 65 and over, regardless of income, at about 1/6 the overhead cost of what it would cost private insurance to do it. Half of the elderly had no health insurance whatsoever when Medicare was passed. And it's instructive to note that Medicare, like Social Security, was not at all popular when it was first passed. The opposition to Social Security was just as obstructionist in 1935 through 1937, even requiring a Supreme Court decision as the opposition to the Affordable Health Care Act today. So today, Medicare's approval rating by its beneficiaries is 90%, but it was not always so. It was 45% the year after it was passed. And changes in policy that have increased child poverty have taken the following forms: cuts of 35% in the old welfare program, aid to families with dependent children, from the early 60s until that program was abolished, in 1996. And the replacement of aid to families with dependent children at that point by temporary assistance to needy families, or in Iowa, welfare is called the Family Investment Program. The result has been that about 1/5 as much is spent on cash welfare today as in 1996, and over twice as many poor report that they simply have an income of less than $2 per person per day. So the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a sociologist or an urbanologist before he went into politics. And with a bit of hyperbole, but with essential accuracy, he said, the war on poverty that we Americans really tried to fight, that is the war on poverty among the elderly, we won. The war on poverty among children that we didn't really try to fight, if anything, quite the contrary, we didn't win. And as I'll note later, the sharp rise in the number of single-parent families has certainly played a very important part in the increase in child poverty. Second, by where one lives, and I'll step on the gas here so we'll have time for questions. Poverty is not confined to central cities. In fact, more poor people live in suburbs than in inner cities. Even though the poverty rate is lower in suburbia, there are vastly more people living in suburbs than within cities. My home city of Cleveland, when I was growing up, had nearly 1 million people. Today it has 380,000. But the greater Cleveland area has between 1.5 million and 2 million people. So there are now more poor people in suburbs than anywhere else. So about 2 in 5 poor people live in central cities, slightly more than 2 in 5 live in suburbs, and about 1 in 5 live in rural areas of less than 2,500 people. Third, by race and ethnicity, minorities have much higher poverty rates, but again, well over 40% of America's poor are white. However, as I point out about halfway down page 3, many minority persons in poverty live quite a different life from the poor who are not minorities. Their poverty is likely to last longer. They are much more likely than whites to live in poverty for, in one study, at least 10 years out of a 20-year period, a longitudinal study in which people were followed over time. They are more likely than non-minorities to be the poorest of the poor, that is, to have incomes less than 1/2 of the poverty line. Nearly half of America's poor have incomes below half of the poverty line. So when we quibble about where the poverty line should be set, we need to remember that most Americans living below the poverty line live well below the poverty line, in most cases $8,000 or $10,000 below the poverty line. Work and unemployment, I'll give you data there. Yes, unemployment is far higher among the poor, but most poor households have at least one wage earner. By educational attainment, by family composition or marital status, by gender, poverty rates are significantly higher among women than men, especially true among the elderly, simply because elderly women are much more likely to live alone and to have only one income. So there are 3 women for every 2 men over the age of 65, 5 women for every 2 men over the age of 85. I know my dad preached in nursing homes for 61 years, so I have clear memories of going with him to the Welsh home, particularly as a kid. And I would ask him later, where are all the men? And he would say, well, for one thing, women are usually much more religiously observant than men. That's not just true in the United States, but in most of the world. But also, many of the men had died. The average difference in life expectancy between men and women has narrowed from 8 years to 5.5 years, but it is still the case that there's a great gender imbalance. So women are much more likely to be on their own. All 3 siblings of mine have been widowed. When my brother's first wife died 7 years ago, he began to date again fairly quickly, and it was poignant, but at times a bit amusing for him to send emails to my 2 sisters and me saying, all right, here is woman number 1, here are her positive attributes, here are the ways in which I don't think we're so compatible, here is woman number 2, number 3, number 4, how do I make up my mind? And he had the insight to say, I realize I haven't just become a babe magnet, but the numbers are in my favor. Finally, I just said to him in exasperation after about a year of this, do you really love any of these women sentimentalists that I am? And stop being so bloody analytical about all this. But women's poverty rate is higher than men's at all other ages, not just among the elderly. By duration, it is a half-truth to say that most poverty is long-term. Many of the poor are in poverty and on public assistance for no more than a year or 2. So I like David Elwood's summary statement a little more than halfway down page 5. The ghettos, when we think of poverty, we may think of Ferguson or Baltimore or Cleveland or Staten Island. The ghettos contain the most visible and readily identifiable poor, but what one misses in them is the mass of poor people that we have been discussing. The full-time working poor, the retired and disabled, divorced mothers struggling to get on their feet, unemployed workers, rural farmers, young families who are starting out. These are much closer to the true faces of American poverty. Policymakers who see only black faces in Harlem are committing as grave an oversight as those who ignore those faces altogether. Even among poor blacks, fewer than 20% live in ghetto neighborhoods in large cities where at least 40% of the residents are poor. Poor Americans are more often among us than isolated from us. Americans misunderstand the nature of poverty. Less than 10% of poor children live in big city neighborhoods. At least twice that number live in 2-parent families with a full-time worker. I've mentioned before the severity of poverty with, I think it's 47% of the poor have cash incomes below half the poverty line. Then I go through and give you quick summaries of public programs for poor persons. In the bib at the back, I've provided you a couple of sources that I think are extremely useful for current data. For information about poverty at the national level, about the 5th source down, is an organization called the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and I'll give you their website there. Also, a little further down is the Iowa Policy Project in Iowa City and their website, and they have a lot of detailed, specific data for Lynn County. I wanted to re-emphasize what I said before about the bifurcation of the poor. Catherine Eden, in these 2 books, divides the poor who no longer receive welfare, which is just about all the poor, into two groups. The first group is made up of those who have gone to work and qualified for tax credits, expanded tax credits, and child care tax credits as well, lifted about 3.2 million children out of poverty in 2013. The second group, however, Eden argues, the ones who have gone off welfare and are not working, has really suffered. These are the very poor who are without work, part of a population that is struggling desperately. The losers are an estimated 3.4 million children who, over the course of a year, live in at least 3 months in the less than $2 per person per day household. In 2012, 1 in 5 households receiving food stamps reported no other source of income. And I note here in the handout, in the part I didn't go over, the average food stamp benefit today comes out to about $1.15 per meal. So that the fact that food stamps today have a new name, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the use of the word supplemental is apt there. It won't get you close to the amount of food you need for a whole month. If I could recommend just one book from the list, and this is a major topic I'm not going to be able to address today, I would recommend Robert Reich's new book, titled Saving Capitalism, where he points out the macroeconomic changes that have been involved. That is, the fact that since the early 1970s, corporate profits and worker productivity have continued to go up just as rapidly as they did before, but wages have hardly gone anywhere. That is, that additional wealth has gravitated to the top of American society, and much of the rest of society, particularly the bottom 20%, has ended up getting it in the neck. So between 1955 and 1975, the American economy doubled and the average worker's wages doubled. Since 1975, the American economy's wealth has doubled again per capita, and wages for most workers are in the single digits as best. In other words, a situation of economic stagnation, except for the very wealthy. The last point that I want to make is that this is a choice that you and I make politically. That is, there's nothing inevitable about our having 1 in 8 Americans living in poverty. If you look at what most other post-industrial nations around the world have done, this is a choice. That is, America's poor are poor by global standards, said a recent article in Slate, because we have decided to leave them so. Paul Krugman, in a recent column on Denmark, pointed out the extremely low poverty rate there, and the fact that the Danish government provides 3 times as much aid to its citizens as the US government does. One thing about those programs is that they are universal rather than targeted just at the poor, and therefore that they enjoy more political support than programs for the poor. Wilbur Cohen of the Social Security Administration used to say, a program for the poor becomes a poor program. That is, it becomes vulnerable at budget cutting time. So there's nothing about our current situation that is completely intractable. And Krugman goes on, honestly, to say, well, the Danes are willing to have an average tax rate of about 50% in contrast to our 25%. But these are political choices that you and I make, not just the result of the bad choices that sometimes we've seen our Family Promise clients in this building making, and some of them have been nobly striving for a life of economic independence and are responsible to their families. So I hope, at least I've given you today, a sense of the variety of the poor, the variety of the programs that support them. some of which have worked and some have not. And on the second to last page, in the last paragraph, I've scrawled down some possible constructive changes that could help to reduce poverty. I don't think any of those are especially new, but I think all of them could make a significant contribution to the reduction of poverty. I suppose, I'm sorry, I've gone way over my time, Ron.
In what ways does poverty restrict the potential of kids growing up in poor homes? And then also, once they become young adults, how does it restrict their ability to move upward? And to what extent does the culture that they're involved with that's not mainstream contribute to their inabilities to achieve?
I think Ellen's been far more immersed in the literature on childhood development than I have, particularly how crucial the first 18 months of life are to cognitive development.
From conception to age 2.
Okay. So I think even though there are programs like WIC, Program for Women, Infants, and Children, I think to some degree not having enough to eat, not living in a safe neighborhood, all those things restrict kids' developments from very early in their lives. Also, I'd be the first to admit, even though my stepsister was a admirable teacher for 35 years in the Cleveland Public Schools, even with her almost superhuman dedication and competence, it was very hard for learning to take place in that kind of environment. So I think the financial barriers are significant, particularly since one of the books on the bibliography, Robert Putnam's book, Our Kids, by a Harvard political scientist, has pointed out there's a lot of pay-to-play opportunities in today's schools. That is, a lot of programs for which you need to pay substantial amounts of money in order to participate in the schools. So that's another restriction. Also, I think the cost of college has grown far more rapidly over the past 30 years than the cost of living or than average income has. So I think those are some barriers that I would point out. My son lives and his wife and our 2-month-old baby granddaughter live in the inner city of Baltimore, and I think probably will not stay there when Lillian grows up for some of those reasons. I think the culture of poverty argument has some merit, but I think it's overstated. There's the famous conversation that supposedly occurred between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, in which Fitzgerald, who was very enamored with the ways of the rich, said, "The rich are different from you and me," and Hemingway, with the usual terse bluntness, said, "Yeah, they've got money." I think in the case of poverty, culture of poverty theorists would argue the poor are different from you and me, and my primary response would be, yeah, they don't have money. So I think I'm not discounting the culture of poverty argument that Paul Ryan has made this argument, for example, that there are large neighborhoods in inner cities where people don't know what work is, have never seen an adult work. But again, those kinds of neighborhoods constitute a relatively small proportion of the poor. I think most of the poor work in, are afflicted particularly by low-wage jobs. And the fact that the minimum wage today would be over $25 an hour if it had kept up with inflation since the late 1960s. So I think many poor people feel trapped by extreme low-wage jobs, and the demise of unionism certainly hasn't helped. The percentage of American workers who are members of labor unions is down in the private sphere has gone down from 33% to 7% since 1960. So the average worker in 1960 was a guy at Ford or General Motors making somewhere between $25 and $30 an hour. Today at Walmart, about a third that much. Oh, and then I'm afraid I need to leave.
The fact that we don't index the minimum wage is just a complete mystery to me.
Well, I don't think it's a mystery because, again, the poor are not a particularly powerful or influential constituency. But yeah, the fact that it's not.
Failure of the Democratic Party then.
Well, okay.
You don't hear people on the campaign trail, and they know they're talking about poor.
No,
They're talking middle class.
yeah, I agree exactly. And the last person I remember doing so was John Edwards. But yeah, I'm not sure I'd call it the third rail of American politics, but it's something candidates obviously see that they have little or nothing to gain from raising that issue. Well, I'm sorry.
Statistics also show that most Americans think they're middle class, even though many of those people self-identifying as middle class are actually either the upper levels of the poor or the lower levels of the wealthy.
Right. Well, I remember one of my first memories after moving to Cedar Rapids in the late 70s was a conversation with Dwayne Arnold in which he identified himself as middle class. If you're middle class, what does that make? So, I'm sorry I've got on for so long.
Thank you very much.